Hey everyone, so here is a practice video for macro unit 4, okay, just like I did for unit 3. My recommendation here would be that you look at the question, you practice, you write it out, and then see how you did as I go over it piece by piece. Hopefully me going over it piece by piece helps explain why the answers are what they are, helps clear up any confusion you may have. All right, so let's get started. All right, so first question is from 2010. Okay, it's FRQ number 1, again, which is a longer FRQ. So let's start with the first parts here. Assume that the United States economy is currently in long-run equilibrium. Draw a correctly labeled graph of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and show each of the following. The long-run aggregate supply curve, the current equilibrium output and price levels labeled as YE and PLE respectively. So before we even move on, you'll notice that that is from Unit 3. Okay, and this is a Unit 4 video. However, you remember from the last video, FRQs, especially in macro, touch on multiple topics, okay? Especially number 1. Number 1 will generally test students on multiple topics, sometimes definitely 2, sometimes 3 or even 4, okay? There's FRQs that test students on Unit 2, 3, 4, and 5, okay? Seeing if you can put everything together. That's the point in macro, all right? So first thing we have to do is we have to draw a graph, right? So we're going to look at our graph here. This graph includes parts from the rest of the question, but what you should draw is AD1, okay, SRAS1, and LRAS, okay? Boom, your long-run aggregate supply curve is always vertical. Okay, we are in long-run equilibrium. What does that mean? It means that our short-run aggregate supply and our aggregate demand are going to intersect on our long-run aggregate supply, which is YE. This could also be YF, okay? But they specifically ask us to label it YE. If our equilibrium was over here, then you would label that YF and put YE over here. All right, and then where they intersect, we're going to have PLE, okay? All right, the next part. Assume that the government increases spending on national defense without raising taxes, okay? So they're spending money. They're not raising taxes to take money out of the economy to spend. They're just spending more money. Okay, so on your graph in part A, show how the government action affects aggregate demand. Government spending, one of the 4 shifters of aggregate demand. Our aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. It's going to increase. So we get AD2. It didn't ask you to label a new equilibrium, so you don't have to, okay? It just specifically asks, show the government action, okay? So we have a new aggregate demand. The point where it says without raising taxes, the reason it says that is because if it just says increases spending on national defense and raises taxes, we wouldn't know what would happen because we would have an increase from the increase in spending and a decrease from the increase in taxes. But since they're not raising taxes, we only have an increase. All right, second part. How will this government action affect the unemployment rate in the short run? Explain. The unemployment rate is going to go down because real output increases. Okay, if you look at your graph here, you didn't label an equilibrium. You don't have to. If you did, I would recommend that you do that just because. But you would be here. All right, we are beyond full employment, so we're going to have a lower unemployment rate. All right, so that's it for B. Moving on to C. Assume that the economy adjusts to a new long-run equilibrium after the increase in government spending. How will the short-run aggregate supply curve in the new long-run equilibrium compare with that in the initial long-run equilibrium? In part A, explain. The answer there, it's going to shift to the left. Okay, we have it drawn graphically here. Basically, what this asks you to do is say what's going to happen and then do it on your graph. So that's what you're doing here. First part, it's going to shift to the left because wages, prices are going to increase. We are beyond full employment. More people have jobs, more people have money, more people are spending. Prices are going to go up. Wages are going to go up. Why do wages go up? Well, if we have a low unemployment rate, that means it's harder for businesses to find workers. There's less workers available. How do you get more workers to come work for you? You raise the wage. So what happens? Short-run aggregate supply goes back. We are back at equilibrium. We draw that on our graph. Okay, so this graph right here shows everything you should have done for A1 and 2, B1 and C2, B2 and C1 should have been written out. All right, so let's look at the rest of the question. We have part D and part E. In order to finance the increase in government spending on national defense from Part B, the government borrows funds from the public. Using a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market, show the effect of the government's borrowing on the real interest rate. If you watch the Unit 3 video, we drew the loanable funds graph on 2 questions. We're already drawing it on the first one here. They like to ask you about the loanable funds market. All right, loanable funds market is pretty simple to draw. It is a simple supply and demand graph. The thing you need to do is you need to make sure that you label your axes correctly. You should have quantity of loanable funds down here. This is not price, this is real interest rate. Yes, the real interest rate is the price of money, but it needs to be labeled the real interest rate, R. Okay, so what you should draw, regular demand curve, regular supply curve, where they intersect, Q and R. Boom, done, nice and easy. Okay, Part E, given the change in the real interest rate in Part D, what is the impact of the following? Investment, economic growth rate, okay? I'm sorry, I skipped a point. Back to D. It says show the effect from Part B. Well, there's an increase in demand. Why is there an increase in demand? Because the government did not raise taxes, so in order to spend money, they need to borrow money. Demand goes up. Okay, you get a higher interest rate, higher quantity. All right, back to E. So investment spending is going to decrease. Why? What happened to the real interest rate? Real interest rate went up based on our graph. Okay, the government's borrowing more money, so the real interest rate is higher. Well, when the real interest rate is higher, businesses can't borrow as much. They don't want to because it's more expensive, or they can't afford the interest. So they don't spend as much. What does that lead to? That leads to less investment spending, which leads to less capital growth, okay, which leads to less economic growth. Boom, nice and simple. Hopefully that FRQ made sense. Moving on to the next one. Number 1 from 2015. Assume that the United States economy is operating below full employment. If you haven't figured it out by now, notice most of the number 1s on macro, which are the longer FRQs, are going to start with the United States is in a recession. They are beyond full employment. They are in equilibrium. And then things are going to change, and they're going to involve a loanable funds market, the money market, the foreign exchange market, which we haven't done yet. But generally, it's going to ask you to start at a point with the United States economy or in the economy of some other country, and then you move on from there. All right, so draw a correctly labeled graph of the long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand, and show each of the following. Current equilibrium output and price level labeled as Y1 and PL1. Full employment output labeled as YF. This is what our graph should look like. We are below full employment. So our intersection needs to be to the left of our long-run aggregate supply, below full employment. Okay, what does that mean? That means we are in a recession. Below full employment, the wording might be a little weird. We might think, well, below full employment, 3% is less than 5%. Yes, but below full employment means that our unemployment rate is actually higher. Okay, we are not up to full, we haven't reached full employment yet, is what that means. Okay, so we have our long-run aggregate supply, equilibrium's PL1, Y1, YF goes right under the long-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, make sure you label your axes, real GDP, price level, boom, should be done. All right, moving on. Assume that the Federal Reserve targets a new federal funds rate to reach full employment. Should the Federal Reserve target a higher or lower federal funds rate? So the Fed's going to target a lower federal funds rate. Why? The lower federal funds rate, if you remember, federal funds rate is what banks charge each other for interest. It's called the federal funds rate because the Fed tries to manipulate the economy to change it, but it's actually what banks charge each other. If banks charge each other lower interest rates to borrow money, that means they're more willing to loan out more money, which is expansionary monetary policy. So that's going to help us grow our economy. Given the Federal Reserve action you identified in Part B, draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market and show the effect on the nominal interest rate. Okay, our first graph here, money market. First time we've graphed the money market in these practice videos. So, money market graph. Money demand is downward sloping like a regular demand curve. The money supply is a vertical curve, okay? So it says, draw a correctly labeled graph and show the effect. So you're going to start by drawing a regular, sorry. So you're going to start by drawing a regular demand curve, your money supply curve, your intersection, nominal interest rate, money supply, which is M1, okay, not to be confused with M1, M2 types of money. This is just labeling, okay? Now, what's going to happen if they have a lower federal funds rate, the money supply is going to increase. When the money supply increases, the nominal interest rate goes down, okay? Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Moving on, part D. Policymakers pursue a fiscal policy rather than a monetary policy, which means the Fed's not involved, it's government spending. Assume that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8 and the value of the recessionary gap is 300 billion. If the government changes its spending without changing taxes to eliminate the recessionary gap, calculate the minimum required change in government spending. Now, if you remember, there's a $300 billion gap. That does not mean they need to spend $300 billion because of the money multiplier. Money is going to get spent and respent. That's where we need our marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. So, using our MPC, we find our multiplier. The multiplier is 1 divided by the MPS. Well, they don't give me the MPS. Okay, well, the MPS is 1 minus the MPC. So 1 minus 0.8 is 0.2. 1 divided by 0.2 is 5. So in order to figure out how much spending we need to get us to 300 billion, we divide 300 billion by 5 and we get 60 billion. That's how much spending we need to start to get the minimum amount of spending we need to start to get us to close our $300 billion gap. Okay, if the government changes taxes without government spending to eliminate the recessionary gap, will the minimum required change in taxes be greater than, smaller than, or equal to the minimum required change in government spending? Explain. The minimum required change in taxes is going to be greater. Why? Because there's a tax multiplier that is different than the spending multiplier. The tax multiplier is MPC over MPS. Okay, so the tax multiplier is always going to be 1 less than the money multiplier. This should be 0.8 over 0.2, not 0.4, but it's still going to be less than the spending multiplier. So you need a bigger tax change than you do a spending change. All right, part E, assume that the government lowers income tax rates to eliminate the recessionary gap. Will each of the following increase, decrease, or stay the same? The aggregate demand is going to increase because lower tax rates means more disposable income. So you're a consumer. You pay less in taxes every year. You have more money to spend. You're going to spend more money. Not all of the extra money you have, but you're going to spend most of it. Long run aggregate supply is going to stay the same because lower tax rates lead to a higher consumer spending. Okay, or that is what they wanted you to do, but they will also accept, because they were not clear on it, they will also accept that the long run aggregate supply is going to increase because it's going to lead to more investment spending. What they should have done here, they should have wrote lowers income tax rates on consumers, but they didn't. So you have students that can and will rightly argue they're going to lower tax rates on businesses too, which means more investment spending, which means more capital, more economic growth. They were looking for the first part, but they didn't word this correctly. They should have lower income tax rates on consumers. So either one of these is correct. Okay, you don't have to write both. Either one of them would be correct. All right, so hopefully that one made sense. Let's keep moving on. All right, now we have FRQ number 2 from 2016. Okay, here we have a bank balance sheet. Bank balance sheet have been on the FRQ for the exam a number of times, not every year, every 2 to 3 years. Okay, they like doing these though, not in a number 1 question, either number 2 or number 3. So let's look at our question here. So number 1, assume that the required reserve ratio is 10%. what is the dollar value of new loans that First Superior Bank can make, and why? Explain. New loans that they can make are 0. Well, why? They have money, right? Not exactly. So 10% is their reserve requirement. They have $2,000 in demand deposits, $2,000. They're only holding $200. $1,800 is what's already loaned out. Okay? They're only holding 10%. They can't go lower than that. So they can't loan out any more money. Okay? That's why. A lot of students got this wrong. This question in 2016, a lot of students missed part A. And if you miss part A, you miss most of the rest of the question because it kind of throws off your numbers. They're all loaned out. They can't loan out 90% of that 200. They have to hold that because that is 10% of this $2,000. 1,800 is already loaned out. So the answer here is 0. All right, Mr. Smith deposits $100 of cash in a demand deposit account in First Superior Bank. Calculate the maximum amount of new loans that First Superior Bank can now make. So they can't loan out any more money of what they already have. They now get an extra $100. They have to keep 10%, so they can loan out the other 90%. So it's 90% of 100, $90. They can loan out $90 of this $100. All right. As a result of Mr. Smith's $100 cash deposit, calculate the maximum change over time in each of the following: loans and demand deposits. Okay, so for loans, all right, so for loans, what it's going to be is $900. Why? Because that money can get loaned out and loaned out. Okay, and you multiply it times the multiplier, which is going to be 1 over the reserve requirement, which is 10%. So it's 1 over 0.1, which is 10. So that's $900. Okay, and then for demand deposit, it's going to be 1,000. For that, you multiply the actual deposit times the multiplier, which is 10. So you're going to have $1,000 in deposits, $900 in loans. This one's also easy to figure out because if you have $900 in loans that are possible, to get the demand deposit, to add the original, which was 100, so the 900 plus 100 is 1,000. Okay. Part D. Okay. As a result of Mr. Smith's $100 cash deposit, calculate the maximum change over time in the money supply. Answer there is 900. It's going to be the same as the new amount of loans, because loaning out money is how you create new money. So if you loan out an extra $900, you've created an extra $900. And then lastly, part E, provide one reason why the actual change in the money supply can be smaller than the maximum change you identified in part D. So why might we not get an actual creation of $900? Pretty simple. Banks don't always loan out all of their excess reserves. Sometimes they want to keep money. Why might a bank want to keep money? Because there's always the off chance that a bunch of people come to the bank and withdraw all their money. Let's say you loan out let's say the reserve requirement is 10%, you loan out 90% of your money, and all you have on hand is 10%. Anytime someone comes to the bank and withdraws money, that's now dropping you under the 10% requirement, and you have to get more money. Well, if you're not having people come and deposit money, you have to figure out another way to get to that 10%. So banks often will keep more than they're required to just to play safe. Okay, so hopefully that one made sense. Okay, let's move on to our last FRQ. All right, so right now we're going to look at FRQ number 2 from the 2018 exam. All right, assume the economy of Uchalin is currently at full employment. The government of Uchalin reduces the tax rate on household interest earnings. So what will happen to private savings in Uchland? Private savings are going to go up. Okay, what does that mean? The government reduces the tax rate. This is similar to the 2015 FRQ. You lower the tax rate, people have more money. Private savings, what does that mean? It means individuals. Private individuals saving money. You have more money. Yes, I said before that you're going to spend the money. I didn't say you're going to spend all of it. So some of your savings is going to go up. Pretty simple. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market and show the effect of the change in private savings identified in Part A on the equilibrium rate. Okay, notice it says draw a graph and then show the change. Okay, so you have to draw a regular graph and then shift one of the curves. All right, so loanable funds market again. Okay, we've been drawing this graph a lot over these 2 review videos. Equilibrium, okay, equilibrium here, you have your supply, your demand, real interest rate right here, little r, boom. Okay, now there's higher savings, more savings. What does that mean? More money can be loaned out. Well, why is that the answer? Because where do banks get money to loan out? Banks get money to loan out from individuals putting money in an account. You have a bank account. You put money in that account, banks are loaning out that money. That is why they pay you interest rates. Yes, it's small, but they pay you a small interest rate so they can loan out your money and make more money. Okay, it's not that you're going to the bank and you're giving them cash and they're guarding that little pile of cash for you. They're loaning that money out and then they're promising to give you back money when you want. That's how banks make a large chunk of their money. So when people are saving more money, banks are able to loan more money out. So you get an increase in supply, drop in the real interest rate, increase in quantity. All right, Part C, given the real interest rate change identified in Part B, answer the following questions. What is the short run effect on aggregate demand? Explain. What is the long run effect on the potential gross domestic product? So Part A, aggregate demand is going to increase because the decrease in the real investment interest rate will result in an increase in interest sensitive spending. What does that mean? Consumption, investment, net exports. Things that are going to increase based on the interest rate dropping. Okay, interest sensitive spending, people are going to spend more money based on the change in spend more or less money based on the change in the interest rate. In this case, the interest rate drops, so consumption, investment, net exports are going to go up. So our short run aggregate demand, the short run effect on our aggregate demand is going to increase. What about the long run effect on our potential gross domestic product? Potential real GDP is going to increase because of one reason here, investment. Consumption is good in the short run, doesn't always help in the long run. Net exports, good in the short run, doesn't always help in the long run. However, investment, that is what's going to help increase our potential real GDP. All right, hopefully these questions made sense to you. Hopefully you're able to practice them, you're working through them, okay? And this video helped explain why each of the answers was what it was.